Colorado Territory, 1879. The sun hung low over the jagged peaks of the Rockies, painting the valley in hues of amber and gold. Grant Newsom tightened his grip on the reins as his horse picked its way down the rocky path towards Silveridge. At 25, he had already seen enough of the West to know that trust was a luxury few could afford out here. Men died for misplacing it, women suffered, and only the wary survived. The late September air carried the first hint of winter's bite, but it was not the cold that had Grant pulling his coat tighter. It was the memory of what happened the last time he had allowed himself to believe in another person's word. His brother's grave back in Kansas stood as testament to that mistake, a mistake he had sworn never to repeat. As the trail widened and the town came into view, Grant adjusted the Colt revolver at his hip, a habit born more of comfort than necessity. Silveridge was barely a town, just a collection of wooden structures sprouted like mushrooms along the base of the mountain, where silver veins had been discovered 2 years prior. Now it bustled with miners, merchants, and the usual assortment of frontier opportunists. Just passing through, Grant reminded himself as he nudged his buckskin gelding forward. One night at the boarding house, supplies restocked, and then back to the solitude of the open range where a man could trust his instincts without the complications of other people's lies. That was the plan anyway. The main street was churned to mud from recent rains and the constant traffic of wagons and horses. Grant dismounted in front of the general store, looping his reins around the hitching post. His tall frame and broad shoulders, hardened from years of working cattle, drew a few curious glances, but most folks in Silveridge had learned to mind their own business. The bell above the door jangled as Grant pushed it open. The store's interior was dim after the bright afternoon sun, and it took a moment for his eyes to adjust to the shadowy space crowded with barrels, shelves, and hanging goods. "Be right with you," called a voice from the back. Grant nodded even though no one could see him and began making mental notes of what he needed. Coffee, beans, salt pork, ammunition, the basics that kept a man alive out here. He was examining a new Bowie knife when the back curtain parted and a young woman stepped through. Grant's hand froze mid-motion. She couldn't have been more than 22, with honey blonde hair gathered in a practical bun at the nape of her neck, though wayward strands had escaped to frame her face. Her dress was simple but well-made, blue calico that matched eyes the color of a clear mountain lake. But it wasn't her obvious beauty that caught Grant off guard, it was the wariness in those eyes, a look he recognized all too well from his own reflection. "Can I help you find something?" she asked, her voice carrying the soft lilt of somewhere back east. Grant cleared his throat, just restocking supplies passing through. She nodded and moved behind the counter. "New in Silveridge." "Just for the night," Grant replied, setting the knife down and moving toward the counter with his mental list. "Need coffee, beans, ammunition for a Colt .45, and whatever you have in the way of fresh provisions." The woman, Grant noticed she wore no wedding ring, began gathering his requested items with efficient movements. "You have the look of a cattleman, not a miner." Grant raised an eyebrow, that obvious. A hint of a smile touched her lips. "The way you stand, miners hunch from bending in the shafts. Cowboys stand tall from watching horizons." Grant found himself smiling back just slightly. "Guess there's no hiding it then." "I'm Faith Evans," she offered, measuring coffee beans into a paper sack. "My father and I run the store." "Grant Newsom," he replied, tipping his hat slightly, "heading north to deliver some cattle to the Peterson spread." Faith nodded, continuing to gather his supplies. "Alone, that's unusual for a cattle drive." "Just 10 head." "Nothing I can't manage." Grant watched her hands as she worked, noting a small scar across her right knuckles. Working hands, not a pampered storekeeper's daughter. "Where are you staying?" she asked. "Figured the boarding house if they have room." Faith shook her head. "Mrs. Tillman's place is full up with miners. There was a new strike last week." She hesitated, then added, "My father has a room above the stable out back." "It's simple but plain. You're welcome to it for the night." Grant's instinct was to refuse, getting entangled with locals, even for a night invited complications. But the alternative was sleeping rough, and the clouds gathering over the mountains promised rain. "That's kind of you," he said carefully. "What would your father charge for such a room?" $1 including breakfast," Faith replied, tallying his purchases. "He's away in Denver getting supplies. Won't be back until next week." That gave Grant pause, a young woman alone offering a strange man lodging. It spoke either of desperation or foolishness. Neither quality endeared her to him. "That seems unsafe, Miss Evans." offering rooms to strangers when you're here alone. Her blue eyes flashed and her chin lifted slightly. I keep a shotgun under the counter, Mr. Newsom, and I know how to use it. Besides, Tom Walsh from the blacksmith's checks on me twice daily, and I have an arrangement with Sheriff Miller. Her expression softened slightly, but I appreciate your concern. Grant nodded, reassessing her, not foolish then, practical. He could respect that. Then I accept your offer, he said, thank you. As Faith finished wrapping his purchases, the bell above the door jangled and 3 men entered. Their clothes were trail-worn, their expressions hard, and Grant instinctively tensed. He recognized their kind immediately, not miners or merchants, but the sort of men who lived by whatever means necessary, legal or otherwise. Well, look what we have here, said the tallest of the 3, a man with a scar running from his eye to his jaw. The lovely Miss Evans. Faith's expression remained neutral, but Grant saw her hands slide beneath the counter. Gentlemen. What can I help you with today? Just passing through, the scarred man said, mimicking Grant's earlier words with a mocking grin. Thought we'd stock up before heading to California. Then I'll thank you to state your business and move along, Faith replied, her voice steady. I close in an hour. The man chuckled, looking to his companions. Hear that, boys? The lady's in a hurry. He turned back to Faith. We're looking for a friend who passed through here. Blonde fella about your age, name's Eddie Evans. Any relation? Grant saw Faith's face pale slightly, though her expression remained composed. No relation, she said firmly. Evans is a common name. The scarred man's eyes narrowed. That's so. Funny, because word is Eddie had a sister up this way, pretty little thing with yellow hair. His gaze traveled over Faith in a way that made Grant's hand drift toward his pistol. Said she might know something about some missing money that belongs to friends of ours. I'm afraid I can't help you, Faith said, her voice cooler now. As I said, no relation. The tension in the room thickened. Grant shifted his weight slightly, drawing the men's attention. Your husband? Asked the scarred man, eyeing Grant. Before Faith could answer, Grant spoke. Just a customer. But I reckon the ladies answered your question, and it sounds like you gentlemen need to be on your way to California. The 3 men exchanged glances, measuring the situation. Grant stood relaxed but ready, his eyes never leaving the scarred man's face. After a moment, the leader shrugged. Another time, then, he said, tipping his hat mockingly to Faith. We'll be in town a few days. If you happen to remember anything about Eddie Evans, you let us know. We're staying at the Silver Summit Saloon. With that, the 3 men left, the bell jangling discordantly in their wake. Faith's hand emerged from beneath the counter, and Grant caught a glimpse of the promised shotgun before she returned it to its hiding place. Friends of yours? Grant asked lightly, though he suspected the answer. Faith's composure cracked slightly. Hardly, she busied herself with his packages, avoiding his eyes. That'll be $4.75 for the supplies. Grant counted out the money, adding an extra quarter. And $1 for the room. Faith nodded, taking the money and finally meeting his eyes. Thank you, I'll show you where it is once I close up. As she turned away, Grant found himself saying, those men seemed mighty interested in this Eddie Evans. Faith paused, her back to him. For a long moment she said nothing. Then very quietly, my brother is dead, Mr. Newsom. He died in a mining accident 2 years ago. Whatever those men want with him, they're too late. The conviction in her voice should have settled the matter. But as Grant gathered his purchases and stepped back into the fading daylight, he couldn't shake the feeling that Faith Evans had just told her first lie. The room above the stable was indeed simple but clean, just as Faith had promised. A narrow bed with a quilt, a washstand with a pitcher and basin, a 3-legged stool, and a small window that looked out over the mountains. Grant set his saddlebags on the bed and tucked his purchases away, keeping his gun belt within easy reach. He had stabled his horse below, taking care of the animal himself despite Faith's offer to help. The stable was well maintained, with fresh hay and clean water troughs. Like the store, it spoke of diligent care and hard work. As dusk settled over Silveridge, Grant made his way back to the main building. Faith had invited him to take supper with her, a simple meal, she'd said, but better than eating alone at the saloon. Grant had accepted more out of curiosity than hunger. Something about Faith Evans's story didn't sit right, and those men's appearance had only heightened his suspicions. He found her in the small kitchen behind the store, stirring something that smelled of beef and vegetables. She had changed from her store dress into a simpler house dress of soft green, and her hair was down, falling in waves past her shoulders. She looked younger, more vulnerable, and Grant felt a twinge of discomfort at the thought of dining alone with her. "Mr. Newsom," she greeted him with a small smile, "I hope the room is satisfactory." "More than," he replied, removing his hat, "and please call me Grant." "Grant then," she said, returning to her stirring. "And I'm Faith, not Miss Evans. No need for formalities when breaking bread together." Grant leaned against the doorframe, watching her work. "Those men today, they seemed mighty convinced your brother might still be alive." Faith's hand stilled for just a moment before resuming its motion. "As I said, they're mistaken. Eddie died in the collapse of the Northern Star mine. 27 men lost that day, including my brother." She glanced at him. "Would you mind setting the table? Plates are in that cupboard there." Grant did as she asked, noting the way she deftly changed the subject. "You mentioned your father is in Denver." "Yes, getting supplies we can't find locally. He goes every few months." She ladled stew into the bowls Grant had set out. "He should return next week." "And he leaves you to manage alone." Faith's eyes met his, a hint of defiance in them. "I'm quite capable, as you saw today. Besides, Silveridge is a small town. Most people look out for their neighbors." "Most," Grant agreed, thinking of the 3 men from earlier, "but not all." Faith sat down across from him, breaking a loaf of bread into pieces. "No place is perfect, Mr. Grant, but it's home now." "Now." She passed him the bread. "We came from Pennsylvania 4 years ago. My father was a shopkeeper there too, but after my mother died, he wanted a fresh start. Eddie had heard about the silver strike, so," she shrugged, "here we are." "And how does a young woman from Pennsylvania learn to handle a shotgun so confidently?" Grant asked, taking a spoonful of the stew. It was good, hearty, and well-seasoned. Faith's smile was sad. "The West teaches you what you need to know, doesn't it? I imagine you weren't born knowing how to drive cattle." Grant conceded the point with a nod. "Fair enough. Though I learned from my father, not from necessity." "And where is your family now?" Faith asked. Grant's expression darkened slightly. "My father passed 6 years back. My mother lives with my sister and her husband in Kansas." "And you're out here alone," Faith observed softly. "By choice," Grant said firmly. Faith studied him for a moment. "Most men I've met who choose solitude are running from something." Grant met her gaze steadily, or toward something, freedom perhaps. "Is that what you're seeking?" "Freedom?" There was genuine curiosity in her voice. Grant considered the question more seriously than he had intended to. "Maybe just space to breathe without wondering if the next person I meet is going to put a knife in my back." Faith's eyebrows rose slightly. "That's a harsh view of humanity. But not an inaccurate one out here." Grant took another bite of stew. "People lie, Faith, they deceive, they betray. The ones who don't are rare enough to be remarkable." Faith was quiet for a long moment, breaking the silence only to pass him more bread. "I'm sorry someone taught you that lesson so thoroughly," she finally said. Grant didn't respond. The conversation had veered too close to memories he preferred to keep buried, and he steered it back to safer ground. "This stew is excellent." "Thank you for sharing it." Faith accepted the change of subject gracefully, and they finished their meal talking of simpler things: the weather, the town's history, the price of cattle. By the time they had finished eating and washing up, Grant found himself reluctantly enjoying her company. Faith Evans was intelligent and well-spoken, with flashes of wry humor that surprised him. As he prepared to return to his room for the night, Faith paused him at the door. "Those men," she said hesitantly, "if they come back tomorrow." "I'll be here until midday," Grant assured her. "And I'd suggest having the sheriff keep an eye on the place after I leave." Faith nodded, looking relieved. "Thank you. Good night, Grant." "Good night, Faith." As Grant crossed the yard to the stable, he found himself looking back at the warm yellow light spilling from the kitchen window. Faith Evans was a puzzle, a young woman alone in a frontier town, telling stories about dead brothers while dangerous men came looking for answers. His instinct was to ride out at first light and leave her mysteries behind. But as he climbed the stairs to his room, Grant knew he wouldn't. Something about Faith's situation tugged at him, reminding him of another time when he had walked away from someone who might have needed help. He wouldn't make that mistake again, not if he could help it, even if it meant delaying his journey one more day to ensure she was safe. Morning dawned clear and cold, with frost rimming the stable window. Grant woke at first light, as was his habit, and spent some time tending to his horse before making his way to the main house. He found Faith already at work, preparing to open the store, her hair once again neatly pinned up. "Good morning," she greeted him. "Did you sleep well?" "Well enough," Grant replied, accepting the cup of coffee she offered. "You're up early." "Always," Faith said with a small smile. "There's breakfast keeping warm on the stove if you're hungry." Grant thanked her and helped himself to the eggs and bacon she had prepared. As he ate, he watched Faith move about the store, sweeping the floor and arranging merchandise with practiced efficiency. "How long have you been running this place alone?" he asked. Faith glanced up from her work. "My father is gone more often than not these days. The trips to Denver keep getting longer." There was something in her tone that suggested this was a sore point. "But I manage, the store does well enough." Grant finished his breakfast and brought his plate to the kitchen. When he returned, Faith was unlocking the front door, preparing to open for the day. "I'll be heading out in a few hours," Grant told her. "Is there anything you need before I go?" Faith turned to face him, looking as if she might say something important, but then the door opened, and a middle-aged woman entered. "Morning, Faith," the woman called cheerfully. "Got any of that peppermint candy in yet? My Henry's been asking after it for days." "Good morning, Mrs. Cooper. It arrived yesterday," Faith replied, slipping easily into her role as shopkeeper. Grant stepped back, letting Faith attend to her customer. The store gradually filled with morning shoppers, miners' wives stocking up on supplies, a few ranch hands picking up tobacco and ammunition, the local schoolteacher purchasing pencils and paper. Grant found himself lingering, ostensibly checking his own supplies, but really keeping an eye out for the three men from the previous day. It was mid-morning when the bell jangled, and Sheriff Miller entered. He was a stocky man with a graying mustache and shrewd eyes that took in the store with a quick sweep before settling on Grant. "Morning, Faith," the sheriff said, tipping his hat. "This the gentleman you're putting up." Faith nodded, making introductions. "Sheriff Miller, this is Grant Newsom. He's passing through with cattle for the Peterson spread." "Grant's Sheriff Daniel Miller." The men shook hands, sizing each other up in the way of strangers who needed to quickly determine if the other posed a threat. "Peterson, eh?" the sheriff said. "Good man. Honest rancher." "So I hear," Grant replied. "I'm delivering some breeding stock from Colorado Springs." The sheriff nodded, seemingly satisfied. "Miss Evans mentioned some troublemakers came by yesterday." Grant glanced at Faith, who was helping another customer across the store. "Three men asking about someone named Eddie Evans, claimed to be looking for missing money." The sheriff's expression darkened. "I know the type, I'll keep an eye out, they staying in town." "Silver Summit Saloon," they said. "I'll pay them a visit." The sheriff turned to Faith, who had finished with her customer. "You have any trouble, you fire that shotgun into the air, and I'll come running." Faith smiled. "Thank you, Sheriff, I'm sure it won't be necessary." After the sheriff left, the store quieted. Grant found himself alone with Faith as she restocked shelves. "You spoke to the sheriff already," he observed. "When?" "I sent Tom from the blacksmith's with a message last night after you retired," Faith explained. "Just being cautious." Grant nodded, approving of her foresight. "Smart, but those men seemed pretty convinced your brother is alive, Faith." Faith's hands stilled on the can she was shelving. "My brother is dead, Grant." "I told you." "Yes, you did," Grant agreed quietly. "But something about your story has those men convinced otherwise, and I can't help wondering why." Faith turned to face him, her expression guarded. "Why do you care?" "You said yourself you're just passing through." It was a fair question, one Grant had asked himself that morning. "Let's just say I've seen what happens when bad men set their sights on someone, and I don't like to leave people facing that alone." Faith studied him for a long moment, then sighed. "My brother is dead to me," she said finally. "Whether he draws breath somewhere else in this world doesn't matter. He made his choices and I made mine." The admission hung in the air between them. Grant waited, sensing there was more she wanted to say. 2 years ago," Faith continued, her voice low, "Eddie got involved with some men in Denver, bad men who robbed banks and stagecoaches. I didn't know, not until he showed up here one night with a bullet in his shoulder and a saddlebag full of money." Her eyes met Grant's, defiant. "He wanted me to hide him, to lie for him. Said he'd stolen his share and run." "And did you," Grant asked, "hide him?" Faith's gaze dropped. "For 3 days. I tended his wound and listened to his plans to go to California, start fresh." Then I heard about the robbery in Denver, 3 men killed, including a young father who tried to protect a woman. Her voice caught. I couldn't. I told Eddie he had to return the money, turn himself in. I take it he disagreed, Grant said softly. Faith nodded. We argued. He left that night with the money and I haven't seen him since. A month later, word came of the Northern Star collapse, 27 men dead, including an Edward Evans. She looked up at Grant. It was easier to believe he died there than to wonder if he was out there somewhere, still hurting people. Grant absorbed her story, trying to reconcile it with the woman before him. And the men yesterday. Must be his former partners, Faith said. They probably think I know where Eddie is or where he hid the money. Do you? Grant asked bluntly. Faith's eyes flashed. No. And even if I did, I wouldn't tell men like that. Grant believed her, at least about not knowing where her brother might be. The money he wasn't so sure about. There was something Faith was still holding back. These men won't just take your word for it, Grant warned her. Especially if they think there's money to be found. I know, Faith said wearily. Why do you think I keep a shotgun under the counter? Why I made friends with the sheriff and the blacksmith? She straightened her shoulders. I've been waiting for someone to come asking for 2 years. I can handle it. Grant wasn't so sure, but he admired her resolve. The sheriff knows all this. Faith shook her head. He knows Eddie was mixed up in something bad and disappeared. I never told him about the money or that Eddie came here after the robbery. I couldn't, she trailed off. Couldn't implicate yourself as an accessory, Grant finished for her, even briefly. Faith's expression was pained. Yes. The bell above the door jangled again, and both turned to see the scarred man from the previous day enter. This time he was alone. Morning, folks, he said with a tight smile that didn't reach his eyes. Hope I'm not interrupting. Grant casually moved to place himself between the man and Faith. Stores open to the public, he said mildly, but I believe the lady made herself clear yesterday. The man ignored Grant, focusing on Faith. I've been thinking, Miss Evans, about how certain I am that Eddie mentioned a sister up in Silveridge, pretty girl with yellow hair and blue eyes. His gaze shifted to Grant. Didn't mention a husband, though. As I told you, Faith began. Here's the thing, the man interrupted, reaching into his coat. Grant tensed, hand moving toward his gun, but the man merely withdrew a folded paper. I have something that might jog your memory. He unfolded the paper, a wanted poster with a crude drawing of a young man with a passing resemblance to Faith around the eyes and jawline. The name Edward Evans was printed beneath it, along with WANTED for robbery and murder and the sum of $500. Looks an awful lot like you, doesn't he? The scarred man said, his eyes on Faith. Same eyes. Same chin. Faith's face had gone pale, but her voice remained steady. Many people share similar features, sir. It proves nothing. The man refolded the poster and tucked it away. Maybe not, but here's what I think happened. I think Eddie came here after Denver with his share of our money. I think he gave it to his loving sister for safekeeping, and I think you know exactly where that money is. You're mistaken, Faith said firmly. The scarred man's false pleasantness slipped. $5,000, Miss Evans, that's what your brother took from me and my partners, and we want it back. Grant stepped forward. The lady's told you she doesn't know anything. I suggest you leave now before the sheriff gets involved. The man's eyes flickered to Grant, assessing. You her protector now, hired gun. Just a concerned citizen who doesn't like to see ladies harassed, Grant replied evenly. For a tense moment the man seemed to consider pushing further, then he smiled, all cold calculation. I'll go, for now, but my partners and I aren't leaving Silveridge until we get what we came for. He tipped his hat mockingly. Good day, Miss Evans, Mr. Newsom, Grant supplied, not bothering to hide his dislike. Newsom, the man repeated, as if committing it to memory. We'll speak again soon. After he left, Faith sagged against the counter, her composure cracking. They're not going to stop, she whispered. Grant moved to the window, watching the scarred man cross the street toward the saloon. No, he agreed, they're not. Faith looked up at him, her eyes troubled. You still plan to leave today? Grant turned back to her, his decision already made. No, not while those men are in town. Relief washed over Faith's face. Thank you, she said softly. I can pay you. Grant held up a hand. I'm not for hire, Faith, but I won't leave a woman alone to face men like that. He hesitated, then added, however, I think you need to tell me the whole truth now. About the money. Faith's gaze dropped to her hands. I told you Eddie took it when he left. And yet those men are convinced it's here, Grant pointed out. Why would they think that unless Eddie told someone it was? Faith was silent for a long moment. When she looked up, there was a new resolve in her eyes. I'll tell you everything, she said, but not here, tonight after the store closes. Grant nodded, accepting her terms. Until then, I suggest we both keep our eyes open. Those men won't wait patiently forever. As if to emphasize his point, the bell jangled again and customers entered. Faith straightened, composed herself, and went to help them, the perfect image of a respectable shopkeeper's daughter. Grant watched her, wondering just how many versions of Faith Evans existed, and which one was telling the truth. The rest of the day passed without further incident, though Grant noticed the scarred man and his companions watching the store from the saloon across the street. He helped Faith with a few deliveries and heavy lifting, giving him an excuse to stay close, and sent a message to Peterson explaining his delay. By the time Faith closed the store for the evening, tension hung in the air like the promise of a storm. Faith moved through her closing routine mechanically, her mind clearly elsewhere. Grant secured the doors and windows, checking the shotgun Faith kept under the counter to ensure it was loaded. They'll make a move soon, he told her as they sat down to a simple supper. Men like that don't have much patience. Faith nodded, pushing her food around her plate. I know. You said you'd tell me everything, Grant reminded her gently, about the money. Faith set down her fork and met his eyes. Yes, I did, she took a deep breath. Eddie didn't take all the money with him when he left, he hid most of it. Grant leaned forward. Here in the store. Faith shook her head. No, in the mine. The Northern Star. The one that collapsed. Yes, Faith's fingers twisted in her napkin. He told me he'd hidden it in an old supply shaft that wasn't being used anymore. Said if anything happened to him, I should retrieve it and use it to get away from here, start fresh somewhere else. Grant frowned. But you said the mine collapsed. It did, but not all of it. Faith's eyes met his. The main shaft collapsed, killing the miners who were working that day, but the supply shaft Eddie mentioned was separate, it wasn't damaged. And the money is still there? Grant asked, understanding dawning. Faith nodded. As far as I know, I never went to get it. I couldn't. It felt wrong, like blood money, but I couldn't bring myself to tell the authorities either. So for 2 years, you've known there was stolen money hidden in an abandoned mine shaft, and you just left it there? Grant couldn't keep the disbelief from his voice. Faith's chin lifted slightly. Yes, what would you have done? Turn myself in for briefly harboring a criminal, try to explain why I knew where stolen money was hidden. Or take it and spend the rest of my life looking over my shoulder, waiting for men like them to come looking for me. Put that way, Grant could understand her dilemma, but now they've found you anyway. Yes, Faith said softly. Now they've found me. Grant considered this new information. How do they know the money is still here, if Eddie didn't take it with him and you never retrieved it? Faith's expression darkened. I think Eddie might still be alive. That wanted poster, it looked recent. She met Grant's eyes. What if he didn't die in that mine collapse? What if he just let everyone believe he did to throw these men off his trail? And now something's happened and they've found out he's alive. And they think he told you where the money is, Grant finished for her, or that you've had it all this time. Faith nodded miserably. They won't believe me if I tell them I left it in the mine. They'll think I'm lying to protect myself or Eddie. Grant rubbed his jaw thinking, the Northern Star, how far from town is it? About 3 miles north up in the foothills, Faith replied. It's abandoned now, no one goes there anymore. They say it's haunted by the ghosts of the dead miners. Convenient superstition, Grant observed, keeps people away from hidden money. A flash of hurt crossed Faith's face. I didn't spread those rumors. People in mining towns are naturally superstitious. Grant held up a hand in apology. I didn't mean to imply otherwise. He considered their options. We could go to the sheriff, tell him everything. Faith shook her head firmly. And admit I helped a wanted criminal, that I've known where stolen money was for 2 years and said nothing. Even if the sheriff believed I never took it, I'd still face charges. Then we need to get you out of Silveridge, Grant decided, tonight before those men make their move. And go where? Faith asked. I have no family, no friends outside of Silveridge. Everything I have is tied up in the store. Grant paused, realizing she was right. Faith Evans had nowhere to run, and even if she did, those men would likely follow. Running wasn't a solution, it was merely a delay of the inevitable confrontation. Then we face them, Grant said, his mind made up, but on our terms, not theirs. Faith looked at him uncertainly. What do you mean? I mean we go to the mine, get the money, and use it to bargain with them. Grant held up a hand as Faith began to protest, not to keep it, to turn it into the proper authorities. But those men don't need to know that. If they believe we have the money and are willing to hand it over, it gives us leverage. It's dangerous, Faith argued. The mine isn't stable, and those men won't just take the money and leave. They'll want revenge for Eddie's betrayal. Probably, Grant agreed, but this way we control when and where the confrontation happens. We can bring the sheriff in at the right moment. Faith was quiet for a long moment, considering. You're risking a lot for someone you just met, she finally said. Why? Grant's expression was somber as memories of his brother surfaced. Because once, I walked away when someone needed help. I told myself it wasn't my problem, that getting involved would only bring trouble. His voice roughened. My brother died because of that choice. I won't make it again. Faith reached across the table and briefly touched his hand, a gesture of understanding that surprised him with its warmth. I'm sorry about your brother. Grant nodded, uncomfortable with both the sympathy and the contact. It was a long time ago. Faith withdrew her hand, seeming to sense his discomfort. If we do this, go to the mine, it needs to be tonight. Those men are watching the store. They'll see if we try to leave in daylight. Tonight then, Grant agreed. After midnight, when the saloon closes and they're likely to be drinking, we'll go out the back way. Faith nodded, her decision made. I'll gather some supplies. We'll need lanterns, rope. She hesitated, then added, and weapons. I have a revolver upstairs besides the shotgun. Grant raised an eyebrow. You're full of surprises, Faith Evans. She offered him a small, sad smile. Out here, a woman alone needs to be prepared for anything. As Faith cleared their supper dishes, Grant moved to the window, checking the street. The scarred man and one of his companions stood outside the saloon, watching the store. Their patience was visibly wearing thin. Tonight would be dangerous, Grant knew. Going into an abandoned mine was risky enough, but doing so with armed men potentially on their trail raised the stakes considerably. Yet he couldn't see another option that didn't end with Faith in jail or worse. For better or worse, his path was now tied to hers. And for the first time in years, Grant found himself caring what happened to another person enough to risk his life for them. It was a feeling he had thought long dead, buried with his brother back in Kansas. That it had resurfaced now, for a woman whose story changed with every telling, was an irony not lost on him. Midnight came with a soft rain that muffled sounds and shrouded the town in mist, perfect cover for their clandestine departure. Faith had changed into practical clothes. A split riding skirt, sturdy boots, and a man's work shirt beneath her coat. Her honey blonde hair was tucked under a hat, and she moved with quiet efficiency as they prepared to leave. Grant had spent the evening checking and cleaning his colt, making sure his horse was ready for a quick departure if needed, and mentally mapping their route based on Faith's description. The Northern Star Mine was north of town, up a winding trail into the foothills. They would need to be cautious. The trail would be slippery in the rain, and the darkness would make navigation difficult. Ready? He asked softly as Faith joined him at the back door, a small pack over her shoulder. She nodded, her expression determined despite the fear evident in her eyes. Yes. Grant checked the alley behind the store before leading Faith to where he had their horses waiting, his buckskin gelding and Faith's smaller bay mare. They mounted quietly and set off at a walk, keeping to the shadows behind the buildings until they reached the edge of town. Only when Silveridge was a cluster of dim lights behind them did Grant allow the horses to pick up their pace, following the muddy trail north. The rain fell steadily, soaking their clothes despite their oilskin coats. Neither spoke, saving their breath for the climb. After nearly an hour of slow, careful progress, Faith pointed to a narrow path branching off to the right. There, she said, raising her voice slightly to be heard over the rain, that leads to the Northern Star. The trail was steep and treacherous, forcing them to dismount and lead the horses. Grant could feel the strain in his legs as they climbed, and he noticed Faith struggling as well, though she made no complaint. Finally, the path opened onto a small clearing where the dark maw of the mine entrance gaped like a wound in the mountainside. We should secure the horses here, Faith said, gesturing to a stand of pines that offered some shelter from the rain. The supply shaft is about 100 yards inside, branching off to the left. Grant nodded, helping her tether the animals before retrieving the lanterns from their packs. He lit one, the warm glow creating a small circle of light in the darkness. "Stay close," he told Faith, drawing his revolver, "and be ready to move quickly if needed." Faith nodded, checking her own smaller pistol before following Grant toward the mine entrance. The wooden support beams were weathered and stained, some showing signs of rot, but the entrance itself appeared stable. A crude sign warned danger, "Keep out," in faded letters. "How long ago did Eddie hide the money here?" Grant asked as they paused at the entrance. 2 years, 2 months, and 14 days, Faith replied, her specificity telling Grant she had counted each one. Grant handed her the second lantern. "Light this, we'll need both inside." Faith did as instructed, and they stepped into the mine, the air immediately growing cold and damp around them. The main shaft extended before them, disappearing into darkness despite their lanterns. The ground was rough and uneven, scattered with debris from the partial collapse further in. "This way," Faith said, pointing to a narrower passage branching off to the left, the supply shaft. They moved carefully, mindful of loose rocks and rotted support beams. The supply shaft was smaller than the main tunnel, forcing Grant to duck his head in places. Faith moved with surprising confidence, suggesting she might have been here before despite her claims to the contrary. "How much further?" Grant asked after they had gone about 50 yards into the supply shaft. Faith held her lantern higher. "Eddie said there was an alcove near the end, where they used to store blasting powder. He said he hid the money behind a loose rock in the back wall." They continued forward, the air growing thicker with dust and the musty smell of long abandonment. Finally, the tunnel widened slightly into a small chamber. Faith's lantern illuminated empty shelves along one wall and a pile of discarded crates in the corner. "This must be it," she said, moving toward the back wall. "He said to look for a rock with a mark like an X scratched into it." Grant kept his revolver ready as Faith examined the wall, running her fingers over the stones. After a few moments, she gave a small cry of triumph. "Here. I found it." Grant moved closer, holding his lantern up to see. Sure enough, a crude X had been scratched into one of the stones near the floor. Faith knelt and began working the stone free, her fingers scrambling for purchase. "Let me," Grant said, handing her his lantern and kneeling beside her. With his larger hands and greater strength, he managed to wiggle the stone free, revealing a small cavity behind it. Faith gasped as Grant reached in and withdrew a canvas bag, heavy and bulging with contents. He untied the drawstring and tipped the bag, spilling stacks of bills onto the dusty floor of the alcove. "It's really here," Faith whispered, her eyes wide in the lantern light. "All this time it was just sitting here." Grant quickly counted the bundles. "Looks like about $4,000, he estimated. "Your brother must have spent some before he got here." Faith nodded absently, staring at the money as if it might bite her. "What do we do now?" "We take it back to town and send word to the sheriff," Grant said, starting to return the money to the bag. "Tell him everything and—" A sound from the tunnel behind them made both freeze. Grant extinguished his lantern with a quick motion, plunging them into darkness save for the dim glow of Faith's light. "What was that?" Faith whispered, her voice barely audible. Grant drew his revolver again, moving to place himself between Faith and the tunnel entrance. "Someone followed us," he murmured. "Extinguish your lantern." Faith hesitated, then complied, leaving them in total darkness. Grant strained his ears, listening. For a long moment there was only silence. Then, unmistakably, the sound of boot on stone echoed down the tunnel. "We know you're in there," called a familiar voice, the scarred man from town. "No way out except past us, Miss Evans. Why don't you and your cowboy friend come on out, nice and easy?" Grant felt Faith's hand find his arm in the darkness. "How did they find us?" she whispered. "Probably followed our tracks in the mud," Grant replied softly. "We didn't exactly cover our trail." He considered their options. The supply shaft was indeed a dead end. There was no way out except past their pursuers. "What do we do?" Faith's voice was steady despite her clear fear. Grant thought quickly. "We have what they want," he said. "That gives us some leverage, but they won't just take the money and leave, not after all this trouble." "Getting impatient out here," the scarred man called. "Don't make us come in after you." Grant made his decision. "Take the money," he told Faith, pressing the bag into her hands. "Stay behind me, we're going to try to talk our way out of this." He felt rather than saw Faith nod. "I trust you," she whispered. The simple declaration hit Grant with unexpected force. This woman, who had every reason to trust no one, was placing her life in his hands. The responsibility settled on his shoulders like a physical weight. "Let's go," he said, moving forward with Faith close behind him. They made their way carefully back down the tunnel, Grant leading with his revolver ready. As they approached the junction with the main shaft, a light appeared, a lantern held by one of the scarred man's companions. "There they are," the man called over his shoulder, "and they've got something." Grant and Faith emerged into the main shaft to find all three men waiting, guns drawn. The scarred man stepped forward, his face twisted in a triumphant smile. "Well, well," he said, eyeing the canvas bag in Faith's hands. "Looks like you found what we were looking for after all, Miss Evans. Your memory seems to have improved." "We have your money," Grant said evenly. $5,000 that Eddie Evans stole from you. Take it and leave Silveridge. Leave Miss Evans alone." The scarred man laughed. "That's not how this works, Cowboy. You see, Eddie didn't just take our money. He betrayed us to the law, got our friend Matheson hung." His eyes hardened. "That kind of debt isn't settled with cash." Faith stepped forward, still keeping slightly behind Grant. "My brother's actions aren't mine," she said firmly. "I've done nothing to you." "Haven't you?" the scarred man asked. "Hiding our money for 2 years, lying to our faces when we asked about it." He shook his head. "No, I think you're cut from the same cloth as your brother. Deceitful to the core." Grant felt Faith stiffen beside him but didn't take his eyes off the three men. "What do you want then? The money isn't enough." The scarred man's smile widened. "Oh, we'll take the money. But we'll also take Miss Evans here on a little trip. Her brother needs to be reminded what happens to people who cross us." "Eddie's dead," Faith insisted. "He died in this very mine." "That's what you kept saying," the scarred man agreed. "But we both know that's not true, don't we? Eddie Evans was spotted in San Francisco just 3 months ago." His eyes gleamed with malice. "And when we send word that we have his beloved sister, I bet he'll come running right to us." Grant felt a cold certainty settle over him. These men had no intention of letting either of them walk out of this mine alive. If they took Faith, she would be used as bait and then killed. If they left Grant, he would be a witness who could identify them. "Not going to happen," Grant said, his voice hardening. "The lady stays with me." The scarred man's amusement faded. "You're outnumbered, Cowboy, and outgunned. What exactly do you think is going to happen here?" Grant's mind raced, searching for a way out. The main shaft of the mine stretched behind the three men, leading to the entrance and freedom. But getting past them seemed impossible without someone getting shot, most likely him and Faith. Then he remembered something Faith had said earlier about the mine collapse. The main shaft had caved in, killing the miners working that day, which meant, "Faith," Grant said quietly, not taking his eyes off the men. "How stable is this section of the mine?" He felt her tense beside him as she understood his implication. "Not very," she whispered back. "The support beams are rotted through in places." The scarred man's patience was visibly wearing thin. "Enough whispering," he snapped. "Throw down your gun and hand over the money, now." Grant made his decision. "The money's yours," he said, lowering his revolver slightly as if in surrender. "But the lady comes with me." And with that, he raised his gun and fired, not at the men, but at the nearest support beam above their heads. The crack of the gunshot was deafening in the confined space. The bullet splintered the rotted wood, and for a heartbeat nothing happened. Then with a groan like a dying beast, the beam gave way. "Run!" Grant shouted, grabbing Faith's arm and pulling her back toward the supply shaft as rocks and dirt began raining down from above. The three men shouted in alarm, scrambling backward toward the mine entrance as the ceiling began to collapse. Grant and Faith raced back into the supply shaft just as a cascade of rock and timber thundered down behind them, filling the main passage with debris and dust. They ran until they reached the alcove, coughing and gasping in the dust-filled air. Grant quickly relit his lantern, illuminating Faith's dirt-streaked face. "Are you hurt?" he demanded, scanning her for injuries. Faith shook her head, still clutching the money bag. "No, you." "I'm fine." Grant moved back toward the tunnel entrance, holding the lantern high. A wall of fallen rock now completely blocked their path back to the main shaft. "But we're trapped." Faith's eyes widened with fear, then narrowed with determination. "Not necessarily," she said. "Eddie told me there was another way out of the supply shaft, an old air vent that leads up to the surface. He said that's how he got in and out without being seen when he hid the money." Grant turned to her, hope kindling. Where? Faith moved past him deeper into the supply shaft. This way. Past the alcove. They hurried forward, the tunnel narrowing even further, until Grant was forced to hunch over to avoid scraping his head on the low ceiling. After about 20 yards, the passage ended at a solid rock face. Dead end, Grant said, frustration evident in his voice. No, Faith insisted, holding her lantern up and examining the wall carefully. It should be here, a vertical shaft with iron rungs embedded in the rock. Grant joined her, running his hands over the rough stone surface. There's nothing here, Faith. Faith refused to give up, moving her lantern methodically across the rock face. It has to be here. Eddie wouldn't have lied about. Her words cut off as her lantern illuminated a narrow crevice in the corner, barely visible in the shadows. There. Grant moved to where she pointed. Sure enough, a tight opening, barely wide enough for a man to squeeze through, was partially hidden by an outcropping of rock. He held the lantern higher and could just make out iron rungs leading upward into darkness. You were right, he said, relief evident in his voice, but it's a tight fit. Faith was already removing her pack and securing the money bag inside it. We don't have a choice. Those men might dig through the collapse, or the rest of the mine might come down around us if we wait. Grant nodded, understanding the urgency. I'll go first, he said, handing her his lantern and holstering his revolver. If the shaft is clear, I'll call down to you. Faith caught his arm before he could move. Grant, she said softly, thank you for everything. You didn't have to help me, but you did. Grant found himself momentarily lost in her earnest blue eyes. Let's get out of here first, he said gruffly, then you can thank me. He turned away, focusing on the task at hand. The opening was as narrow as it looked, requiring him to turn sideways and squeeze through. Once inside, he found himself in a vertical shaft about 4 feet in diameter, with iron rungs set into the rock wall at regular intervals. He tested the nearest rung, finding it sturdy despite its age. It seems solid, he called back to Faith. I'm going up, follow when I give the word. Grant began to climb, testing each rung before trusting it with his full weight. The shaft rose straight up into darkness, the air growing fresher as he ascended. After about 30 feet of climbing, he felt a breeze on his face and looked up to see stars visible through an opening above. Faith, he called down. I can see the exit, it's clear. I'm coming, her voice echoed up the shaft. Grant continued climbing until he reached the top, pulling himself out onto the wet ground above. He was on the mountainside, about 100 yards west of where they had entered the mine. The rain had stopped and the clouds were breaking up, allowing moonlight to illuminate the landscape. He turned and leaned back into the shaft. Faith, how far behind are you? Almost there, she called, her voice closer now. A moment later, her hand appeared at the edge of the opening. Grant grasped it, helping her climb out onto the solid ground. She collapsed beside him, breathing hard, her pack still clutched tightly. We made it, she gasped, looking up at the stars with evident relief. Grant nodded, scanning their surroundings. For now, but those men might have escaped the collapse. We need to get back to the horses and down to town. Faith sat up, brushing dirt from her clothes. The horses are on the other side of the mine. We'll have to circle around. They set off through the wet undergrowth, moving carefully in the dim moonlight. The mountain air was cold, and Grant noticed Faith shivering despite her coat. Here, he said, removing his own coat and draping it over her shoulders. You're half frozen. Faith started to protest, then accepted the additional warmth with a grateful nod. What will we do when we reach town? She asked as they picked their way down the slope. Find the sheriff, Grant replied. Tell him everything, give him the money. Faith glanced at him. Even the part about me harboring Eddie after the robbery. Grant met her eyes. The truth, Faith, all of it. It's the only way to end this properly. Faith was quiet for a moment, then nodded. You're right, no more lies. No more changing stories. They continued in silence until they reached the clearing where they had left the horses. To Grant's relief, the animals were still there, wet but unharmed. As they approached, however, a voice called out from the shadows. That's far enough. Grant and Faith froze as the scarred man stepped into view, his gun trained on them. His face was streaked with dust and blood from a cut on his forehead, but his eyes burned with hatred. You nearly killed us with that cave-in, he said, his voice deadly quiet. My partners weren't as lucky as me. They're still buried back there. Grant pushed Faith slightly behind him. It was self-defense. You were going to kill us anyway. The scarred man laughed humorlessly. True enough, and I'm still going to. He gestured with his gun. The money, throw it over. Faith clutched her pack tighter, and then what? You'll shoot us anyway. Probably, the man agreed. But your only chance of walking away is giving me what I came for, so choose quick death or slow. Grant tensed, measuring the distance between them. The scarred man stood about 15 feet away, too far to rush him before he could fire. Grant's own gun was in its holster, and any move to draw it would get him shot. All right, Faith said suddenly, stepping out from behind Grant. You can have the money, but first tell me the truth. Is my brother really alive? The scarred man's lips curved in a cruel smile. Oh, he was, until about a month ago when we caught up with him in San Francisco. His eyes gleamed with satisfaction as Faith's face paled. He begged for his life, you know, told us you had the money, that you'd been keeping it safe all this time. Faith's voice shook slightly. You're lying. Am I? The man shrugged. Believe what you want, it doesn't matter now. The money. Faith slowly unslung her pack, holding it out. Here, take it and go. The scarred man gestured with his gun. Throw it over. Faith hesitated, then drew back her arm as if to toss the pack. But instead of throwing it forward, she suddenly hurled it high into the air between them. The scarred man's eyes instinctively followed the arc of the bag, and in that split second of distraction, Grant drew his revolver and fired. The shot echoed through the clearing. The scarred man staggered, his own gun discharging harmlessly into the ground before he collapsed. Faith gasped, her hands flying to her mouth as the pack landed with a thud a few feet from the fallen man. Grant moved cautiously forward, his gun still trained on the scarred man. But there was no need for caution. The bullet had found its mark, and the man lay motionless, his vacant eyes staring at the stars above. Is he? Faith asked, not moving from where she stood. Yes, Grant confirmed grimly. He's dead. Faith closed her eyes briefly. I never wanted anyone to die because of this. It wasn't your choice, Grant said, retrieving the money pack. It was his. He chose this path long before tonight. Faith nodded, though the troubled look remained in her eyes. What do we do now? Grant secured the pack to his saddle. We still go to the sheriff, tell him everything. Including this, he gestured to the scarred man's body. Self-defense, plain and simple. They mounted their horses and began the treacherous descent back to town. The eastern sky was just beginning to lighten with the promise of dawn by the time they reached Silveridge. The town was still quiet, most of its inhabitants not yet risen for the day. Sheriff Miller, however, was already at his office when they arrived. He took one look at their dirt-streaked, exhausted appearance and ushered them inside without a word. Over the next hour, Faith told her story, the complete truth, from Eddie's arrival with the stolen money to their encounter with the outlaws at the mine. Grant added his account of the final confrontation, emphasizing that he had fired only when their lives were in immediate danger. The sheriff listened without interruption, his expression growing grimmer with each revelation. When they finished, he sat back in his chair, studying Faith with unreadable eyes. That's a hell of a story, Miss Evans, he finally said. Harboring a wanted criminal, concealing information about stolen money, leading to the deaths of 3 men. He shook his head. By rights, I should lock you up and let a judge sort it out. Faith's face paled, but she nodded. I know, Sheriff, I accept whatever consequences come. I'm just tired of living with lies. The sheriff was quiet for a long moment, then sighed heavily. Your brother was the criminal, not you, and from what Mr. Newsom says those men gave you no choice up on that mountain. He eyed the canvas bag of money sitting on his desk. The bank in Denver will be mighty pleased to get this back, even if it is 2 years late. What happens now? Grant asked, watching Faith closely. Sheriff Miller stroked his mustache thoughtfully. I'll need to send some men up to the mine to recover those bodies, and I'll have to file a report about all this. He fixed Faith with a serious look. It'll be up to the territorial judge what happens to you, Miss Evans. You did harbor a criminal, even if only briefly. Faith nodded, accepting this. But, the sheriff continued, considering you've been an upstanding citizen these past 2 years and that you willingly return the money, I expect he'll be lenient. Especially with my recommendation. Relief washed over Faith's face. Thank you, Sheriff. Don't thank me yet, Miller cautioned. There's still the matter of those men at the mine. I'll need both of you to stay in town until everything's sorted out. Could be a week or more. I understand, Faith said, Grant hesitated, then added, I'll stay as well. My delivery to the Peterson ranch can wait. The sheriff nodded approvingly. Good man. He stood, gathering the money bag. I'll lock this in the safe for now. Both of you get some rest. You look half dead on your feet. As they left the sheriff's office, the sun had fully risen, bathing Silveridge in golden morning light. Faith paused on the boardwalk, looking up at Grant with exhausted but clear eyes. You didn't have to offer to stay, she said softly. You've already done more than enough. Grant studied her face, the honesty now evident in every line, the weight of secrets finally lifted from her shoulders. I'm not leaving until I know you're safe, he said simply. That's just how it is. Faith's smile was like the sunrise, tentative at first, then blooming with warmth. Then I guess we have a week to get to know each other properly. No more changing stories. Grant found himself smiling back, a genuine expression that felt rusty from disuse. I'd like that. As they walked back toward the store, Grant realized something had shifted within him. The wall he had built around himself after his brother's death had developed a crack through which something long dormant had begun to grow again. Trust, hope, perhaps even the possibility of love. Faith Evans had changed her story every time she spoke, it was true. But in doing so, she had somehow helped him change his own story, from one of isolation and distrust to one where connections were possible again. It wasn't a dramatic transformation, not yet. But as Grant watched Faith unlock her store, her movements weary but her spirit unbroken, he knew with certainty that his journey no longer led away from humanity, but toward it. And for the first time in years, that thought didn't fill him with dread, but with anticipation. 1 week later, the territorial judge had come and gone, and as the sheriff had predicted, he had been lenient with Faith. A fine, a stern warning, and the matter was considered closed. The money had been returned to the Denver bank, the bodies of the outlaws buried in unmarked graves, and Silveridge had gradually returned to its normal rhythms. Grant's delivery to the Peterson ranch had been completed, the cattle safely delivered 3 days late but otherwise in perfect condition. Now he stood outside the Evans General Store, his horse saddled and packed for the journey ahead. Faith emerged from the store, closing the door behind her. She had changed in the past week. There was a lightness to her now, a quiet confidence that came from no longer carrying the burden of her secrets. So you're really leaving, she said, approaching him with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. I have a job waiting in Colorado Springs, Grant replied, though the words felt hollow even to his own ears. The ranch manager there is expecting me. Faith nodded, understanding. Of course, you have your own life to get back to. Grant shifted uncomfortably. The truth was, the prospect of returning to his solitary existence no longer held the appeal it once had. The past week with Faith, helping her in the store, sharing meals and conversations, discovering the woman beneath the secrets, had awakened something in him he had thought long dead. Faith, he began, not entirely sure what he wanted to say. She looked up at him, her blue eyes clear and direct. Yes. Grant removed his hat, turning it in his hands. These past days, getting to know you. Have been wonderful, Faith finished for him when he struggled for words. At least for me. For me too, Grant admitted, more than I expected. Faith's smile turned sad, but not enough to change your plans. Grant looked away, watching the morning bustle of Silveridge's main street. I've been alone a long time, Faith, by choice. I'm not sure I know how to be anything else. Faith stepped closer, her hand lightly touching his arm. I understand that better than most, I think. I've been living behind walls too, hiding the truth even from myself. Her eyes met his. But I've learned something this past week, Grant. Walls don't just keep others out, they keep us trapped inside. Grant felt the truth of her words resonate deep within him. His isolation, once a shield against betrayal and loss, had become a prison of his own making. What are you going to do now? He asked. Stay in Silveridge. Faith nodded. It's my home. My father may or may not return. His letters suggest he's found a new life in Denver, but the store is mine now, free and clear. I'll make my way. I don't doubt that, Grant said, a hint of pride in his voice. You're the strongest woman I've ever met, Faith Evans. Faith blushed slightly at the compliment, strong enough to ask for what I want at least. And what's that? Grant asked, though something in her eyes told him he already knew the answer. For you to stay, Faith said simply, or if not stay then to come back, to give whatever this is between us a chance to grow. She took a deep breath. I know it's forward of me to say so, but I've had enough of hiding truths. Grant felt something tighten in his chest, not the familiar constriction of grief or suspicion, but something warmer, more vital. "It's not that simple," he said, though the protest sounded weak even to his own ears. "It never is," Faith agreed, "but some things are worth the complication." She stepped back, giving him space. "I won't try to convince you, Grant. You need to decide for yourself if your old life is truly what you want." Grant looked at his saddled horse, then back at Faith. The path ahead suddenly seemed like a return to shadows after standing in sunlight. "The job in Colorado Springs," he said slowly, "it doesn't start for another 2 weeks." Hope flickered in Faith's eyes. "That's quite a bit of time." "Time enough to help you finish those shelves in the storeroom," Grant suggested, a smile tugging at his lips. "And maybe figure out a few other things as well." Faith's smile bloomed fully now. "I think that sounds like an excellent plan, Mr. Newsom." Grant reached out, taking her hand in his. It was a simple gesture, but for a man who had avoided human contact for so long, it felt momentous. "No more changing stories," he said softly. Faith squeezed his hand, her eyes bright with promise. "No. Just one story now, ours." As they walked back toward the store, Grant felt the last of his walls begin to crumble. The West was still a harsh place, full of dangers and uncertainties. Trust would always carry risks. But for the first time in years, he was willing to accept those risks for the chance at something genuine. Faith Evans had changed her story many times, revealing a little more truth with each telling. And in doing so, she had helped Grant rewrite his own, from a tale of isolation and mistrust to one of second chances and new beginnings. It wasn't an ending yet, rather, it was the start of a different journey altogether. One that, for the first time in longer than he could remember, Grant Newsom was eager to begin.